when that movie came out. Was anything cut from that film?
The studio actually legally couldn't trim it. They couldn't cut anything.
The huge blooper in Blazing Saddles that nobody noticed until now. A studio chairman once grabbed the director of this film by the back of the neck, dragged him into an office, slammed a legal pad in front of him, and started dictating a list of everything that had to go. No farting, no punching horses, no beating up old ladies. Nearly 20 notes in total. If the director had followed every single one of them, the finished movie would have run about 12 minutes long. Instead, when the executive walked out of the room, the director balled up every page of notes and threw the entire wad across the office into a trash can. And that, more than any single joke, is the real reason Blazing Saddles still exists the way audiences know it today. But the story of how this film almost didn't happen, who it almost starred, and what slipped past everyone involved is far stranger than most people realize, even 50 years later. By the time Blazing Saddles hit theaters in February of 1974, America was a country that didn't trust much of anything. The Vietnam War was grinding toward its humiliating end. Watergate was unraveling in real time, and the President of the United States was months away from resigning in disgrace. Faith in institutions, in government, in the polished image Hollywood had spent decades selling, was running on empty. Westerns had always been one of that polished image's biggest exports, full of square-jawed white heroes riding into town to save the day, while everyone else stood quietly in the background. Mel Brooks looked at that entire genre and decided it deserved to be taken apart, piece by piece, in public, with a laugh track. The idea didn't start with Brooks, though. It began as a script called Tex-Ex, written by Andrew Bergman, who originally pictured it as a serious-leaning satire, with James Earl Jones in the lead and Alan Arkin behind the camera. Brooks bought the concept, and then did something almost unheard of for him. Since his early days, writing for Your Show of Shows, he had avoided collaborative writers' rooms. For this project, he broke that habit completely, assembling a team that included Bergman, Norman Steinberg, Alan Uger, and a young, blisteringly funny comedian named Richard Pryor. They hung a sign on the wall of the room where they worked. It read, simply, "Please do not write a polite script." 9 months later, they had a finished screenplay, and Brooks later described the writing process as something close to a verbal free-for-all, with Pryor contributing some of the sharpest racial material and the rest of the team trading jokes back and forth until the script practically wrote itself. Here is where the story takes its first real turn. Richard Pryor wasn't just a writer on Blazing Saddles. He was supposed to be its star. The role of Bart, the sharp, unflappable sheriff at the center of the entire film, was written with Pryor in mind from the beginning. But by the early 1970s, Pryor had also developed a reputation off-screen, one that made studio executives nervous. He had recently been arrested on drug-related charges, and Warner Brothers refused to insure him for the production. Without that insurance, the studio wouldn't move forward with him in the lead role, no matter how much Brooks wanted it. By most accounts, Brooks was furious enough to consider walking away from the entire project over it. But according to Brooks himself, it was Pryor who talked him out of quitting. Pryor reportedly told him that he still had payments coming from the Writers Guild, that they should just go ahead and make the film, and that they would find a good Bart together. So Brooks stayed, and the search for a new lead began. The production reportedly looked at around 20 different actors before settling on Cleavon Little, a Broadway-trained performer Brooks would later describe as standing out immediately for being sharp and assured in a way the role demanded. Pryor kept his writing credit, and many of his contributions, especially the racially charged jokes that gave the film its edge, stayed in the final script even though he never appeared as Bart on screen. Casting trouble didn't stop there. Brooks had his heart set on getting an authentic Western icon for the role of Jim, the alcoholic gunslinger known as the Waco Kid, who becomes Bart's closest ally in Rockridge. He wanted John Wayne. According to Brooks, Wayne actually read the script, found it hilarious, and even reportedly told Brooks he'd be first in line to see it. But Wayne also concluded the material was too risky for his own image and turned the role down. Brooks then cast Gig Young, an Oscar-winning actor who had recently been in recovery. What happened next sounds almost too dramatic to be real, but it's well documented. During Young's very first scene, he reportedly began shaking, vomiting, and had to be rushed away in an ambulance, a visible and frightening withdrawal episode happening live on set. Production stopped cold. Brooks called Gene Wilder, who didn't ask for time to prepare, didn't request rewrites, and got on a plane immediately. By most accounts, he learned his lines during the flight and was on set, fully ready, the very next morning, delivering a performance many critics consider one of the most effortlessly charming in the entire film. Even with the cast finally locked in, the bigger battle was still ahead, and it had nothing to do with who was in front of the camera. It was about what Warner Brothers was willing to let audiences see. When Brooks finally screened a cut of the film for studio executives, the reaction was, by his own description, close to silence. Almost nobody laughed. Several executives reportedly felt the movie was simply too vulgar, too crude, and too narrow in its humor to justify a wide release, and there was real discussion about shelving it entirely and absorbing the financial loss. One studio insider, after watching the chaos play out on screen, reportedly asked how much the picture had cost, and upon hearing the number, suggested they just write the whole thing off. But Brooks had one crucial ally inside the building, John Calley, a Warner Brothers executive who had quietly supported the project from early on, convinced the rest of the studio to sleep on the decision rather than killing the film outright that same night. Brooks, sensing he needed to prove the movie worked with a real audience rather than a room full of nervous executives, arranged another screening almost immediately, this time inviting secretaries, assistants, and regular studio staff, along with friends of the cast. That audience reacted the way Brooks had hoped. They laughed, loudly and constantly, and word of that reaction reportedly made its way back to the executives by the next morning. Calley then pushed for a limited release in 3 major cities, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, as a kind of test run. By the end of that summer, Blazing Saddles had become the studio's biggest moneymaker of the season. That wasn't the end of the studio's objections, though. Even after that successful test run, the chairman of Warner Brothers at the time, Ted Ashley, watched the film and was reportedly stunned by what he saw. According to Brooks, after a screening, Ashley grabbed him by the back of the neck, walked him into an office, handed him a legal pad, and began dictating a long list of demanded cuts. Remove every instance of the racial slur used throughout the film. Cut the entire flatulence scene around the campfire. Remove the moment where the towering henchman Mongo punches out a horse. Cut a suggestive scene between the seductress Lily Von Stupp and Bart in a dark bedroom. By Brooks's own count, there were close to 20 separate notes, and he later said that if he had followed all of them, the final film would have run somewhere around 11 or 12 minutes. Here's the part that makes this entire confrontation almost unbelievable. Brooks had a contract that gave him final cut, meaning the studio legally could not force changes onto the finished film without his approval. Ashley apparently either didn't know this or had forgotten it in the moment. So Brooks sat there, took notes on everything Ashley demanded, and the second Ashley left the room, crumpled the entire legal pad into a ball and threw it across the office into a wastebasket. Calley, who had been sitting beside him through the whole thing, reportedly just looked at the trash can and said, "Good filing." Brooks didn't cut a single line, a single word, or even a single facial expression from the picture because of that meeting. Which brings us to the bean scene, arguably the single most consequential 30 seconds in the history of mainstream American comedy. Picture a group of grizzled cowboys sitting around a campfire after a long day of harassing railroad workers, eating plate after plate of beans, the way cowboys genuinely would have on a real cattle drive. Brooks had a specific frustration with old westerns. They constantly showed men eating beans around campfires, but never once acknowledged what beans actually do to the human digestive system. So he decided to show it. The scene escalates into roughly 30 straight seconds of audible flatulence, each man reacting in his own way, until one cowboy asks for seconds and is firmly told he's had enough. No major studio film had ever done anything like it. When Brooks was asked to tone the scene down, he didn't just refuse. He reportedly went the opposite direction, instructing the sound team to make the effects louder and more pronounced. During test screenings, audiences apparently laughed so hard and so long that they couldn't hear the dialogue immediately following the scene, which led Brooks to go back into post-production and add even more sound effects to fill that gap. There's also a detail about the scene's length that's almost mathematical in its precision. Brooks has said that in his rough cut, he had something like 16 separate instances of flatulence, and through trial and error during editing, he worked to find the exact number that would land the joke, without either falling flat or wearing out the audience's patience, eventually trimming it down to a number he felt hit perfectly. The scene became so iconic and so unmistakable that years later, when the film aired on certain television stations, broadcasters reportedly muted the sound effects entirely rather than air them unedited. The fourth wall-breaking finale deserves its own moment here too, because it represents something genuinely ahead of its time. Rather than wrapping up inside the world of Rock Ridge, the climactic battle deliberately spills outward, smashing through the set walls of the saloon, crashing into a completely unrelated musical number being filmed on an adjacent soundstage, and eventually pouring out onto the actual studio lot and into a real theater, showing the very film the characters are in. At the time, almost nothing in mainstream comedy had attempted something this self-aware, and it's often cited as a direct influence on later self-referential comedies that leaned into characters being aware they're inside a movie. Brooks also built an entire philosophy around embracing accidents and improvisation rather than fighting them. Several of the film's most memorable lines weren't scripted at all. Madeline Kahn, playing the seductress Lily von Stupp, reportedly improvised her breathy, off-key delivery during her musical number, a performance choice that became one of the most quoted moments in the film. Gene Wilder, having joined the production with essentially no preparation time, leaned into a relaxed, almost off-the-cuff delivery style that gave his character an effortless charm that read as completely natural because, in many ways, it was. Cleavin Little's dry, knowing reactions as Bart, the subtle looks and pauses that gave the character so much of his intelligence, were largely shaped during filming rather than written into the original script. And then there's the scene with the Yiddish-speaking warriors, one of the strangest and most quietly audacious choices in the entire film. In a flashback showing Bart as a child, his family's wagon is surrounded by a group of mounted Native American warriors, and the scene is staged to look like it's about to turn into a massacre. Then the chief, played by Brooks himself, opens his mouth and starts speaking fluent Yiddish. The other warriors respond in kind, nodding along, and the tension dissolves into absurdity. It's a joke that works on multiple levels at once, undercutting a tired and ugly trope through sheer, deliberate weirdness, and it's exactly the kind of risk that defines the entire film. So what's the actual blooper? The thing that slipped through unnoticed for decades? It isn't a single dramatic moment or a deleted scene that was hidden away in a vault somewhere. It's something much quieter and, in a way, much more revealing. It's the fact that this film exists in its final form at all. Every single one of its most famous, most boundary-pushing moments, the beans, the slur used to expose racism rather than promote it, the horse punch, the bedroom scene with Lily von Stupp, very nearly didn't make it to audiences. Every one of them was, at some point, on a list of things a studio chairman personally and explicitly ordered removed. The film that's been studied, quoted, and ranked among the funniest movies ever made is, technically, the version that exists only because one director had a contract clause most people forget about, an ally inside the studio willing to back him, and the nerve to throw an executive's notes directly into a trash can without saying a word. That's the real blooper hiding in plain sight. Not a stray pedestrian wandering into frame, not a forgotten line of dialogue. It's the fact that the studio tried, formally and repeatedly, to make Blazing Saddles into something safer, smaller, and far less memorable, and came within one contractual technicality of succeeding. Brooks later said that if he had simply complied with every note he was given that day, the finished film would have clocked in at roughly 11 minutes. 11 minutes, instead of the 93-minute film that went on to earn nearly $120 million at the box office on a budget of about $2.5 million, and that's still being discussed, debated, and dissected half a century later. It's worth sitting with that for a second. The version of film history most people know runs through a fairly clean narrative. Brilliant comedy gets made. Studio doesn't get it at first. Audiences love it. Everyone eventually comes around. But the actual story of Blazing Saddles is messier than that, and arguably more interesting. It's a story about a writer who lost the lead role he was supposed to play, but kept shaping the film from behind the scenes anyway. It's a story about an actor who collapsed on his first day and was replaced within hours by someone who learned the entire part on an airplane. It's a story about a chairman who tried to get the film down to almost nothing without realizing he had no legal authority to do so. And it's a story about a director who was so committed to a joke about beans that he made it louder, not quieter, when people complained. 50 years later, Blazing Saddles is still talked about as a movie that, as the saying goes, could never be made today. Maybe that's true, but it's worth remembering it almost wasn't made at all. Not because nobody had the talent or the vision, but because the people with the power to stop it very nearly did. The blooper isn't on the screen. It's in the paper trail of everything that almost erased the film before audiences ever got the chance to see it, and in the trash can where one director's response to all of it ended up.